Clint Eastwood moved through Hollywood with a calculated quiet, a man who turned minimalism into a weapon. He faced down villains, directed classics, and built an empire on the foundation of controlled silence. Yet, in all his years, there was one man who occupied a unique space in his mind, not as a friend, not as an enemy, but as a singular point of unwavering respect. That man was Charles Bronson. Decades after their paths first crossed in the industry, Eastwood would finally articulate that respect in a statement he never made about anyone else. He said, "He was the only man I never underestimated." This wasn't casual praise or professional courtesy. It was a forensic acknowledgement, the kind offered between two forces who understand each other's source code. This is the story of why that respect existed, why it was laced with a profound and mutual caution, and why the two most formidable screen presences of their generation made a silent, lifelong pact to never share a frame. To understand the weight between them, you must first understand the furnaces that forged them. Charles Bronson's origin story wasn't written in Hollywood, it was carved in the pitch-black depths of a Pennsylvania coal mine. His childhood was not a prelude to fame but a brutal lesson in endurance. Before he was a teenager, he was working underground, a world where language was secondary to labor, where comfort was a fantasy, and where a man's worth was measured solely by his ability to withstand. Bronson didn't develop a tough persona, he was metabolized by a tough life. By the time he arrived in front of a camera, the intensity he projected wasn't a performance choice. It was a geological fact. He carried the silence of the mines with him, a dense, impenetrable quiet that suggested not mystery, but a complete disinterest in the trivial. Audiences didn't watch him act, they witnessed a man who had survived into a state of being that others could only mimic. Clint Eastwood's journey was different in setting but parallel in outcome. The instability of the Great Depression, the constant moving, the necessity of self-reliance, these experiences taught him a similar lesson: control is not given, it is constructed. He built his iconic persona brick by deliberate brick. The squint, the measured delivery, the economy of movement, these were tools of mastery. Eastwood's silence was a strategy, a cultivated art form designed to command attention by withholding it. He used quiet as an instrument. Bronson, however, emanated quiet as a condition. This was the core of their dynamic. One was an architect of containment, the other was its natural element. When their careers ascended and placed them in the same orbit, Hollywood expected fireworks, a clash of egos, a battle for the title of toughest man on screen. What transpired was far more potent and unsettling, a profound, mutual avoidance. There was no feud, no public criticism, no competition for roles. Instead, there was a steady, intentional distance maintained for decades. Crew members who observed them at rare industry functions described not tension, but a heavy, palpable awareness. It was the atmospheric pressure change when two low-pressure systems occupy the same region. They would acknowledge each other with a nod, a brief, knowing glance that communicated everything and nothing. They then would proceed to orbit the room, never colliding, never engaging, maintaining a perimeter that both implicitly understood and respected. The film industry, forever hungry for a sure bet, desperately wanted to team them up. Producers envisioned the ultimate pairing, Eastwood and Bronson, the twin peaks of stoic masculinity. Scripts were written, projects were pitched, fortunes were promised. A particularly compelling Western in the mid-1970s nearly succeeded. It was a perfect vehicle, two aging gunslingers, former partners, reunited. The narrative symmetry was obvious. Eastwood reportedly liked the script. Then he learned Bronson was attached. After a period of contemplation, his answer was a simple, definitive no. On the other side, Bronson, when informed of Eastwood's potential involvement, offered an equally terse dismissal: "Won't work." The project evaporated. This pattern repeated itself until it became a silent understanding within the industry: some combinations were too volatile to contain. The reason was not petty rivalry or insecurity. It was a stark, professional recognition of a fundamental truth about presence. Both men possessed a rare, almost gravitational weight on screen. Their power wasn't in their dialogue but in their being. Eastwood, through meticulous craft, and Bronson, through raw authenticity, had each become a symbol of uncompromising masculinity. To place them together as equals would force the audience into a subconscious comparison. Who commanded more space? Whose silence felt more dangerous? Whose history felt more real? It would transform a collaborative performance into an unconscious gladiatorial contest. Neither man was afraid of losing a fictional fight. Both were astute enough to know that the very act of comparison could diminish the unique mythology each had spent a career building. Their power relied on singularity. A duo would create not synergy, but cancellation. This avoidance was the highest form of professional respect. They were not refusing to work with an inferior, they were refusing to dismantle an equal. In a famous, private anecdote, Eastwood was once asked about Bronson at a small dinner. After a long, characteristic pause, he offered, "Some men don't act tough, they survive into it." He offered no elaboration. None was needed. In that sentence, he linked their destinies. He was acknowledging that while his own toughness was a conscious edifice, Bronson's was a surviving relic. And you do not challenge a relic, you acknowledge its weight and you give it space. As their careers evolved, the thematic shadow of that understanding grew longer. Eastwood transitioned into directing, creating masterpieces like Unforgiven and Gran Torino that deconstructed the very myth of the tough, silent man he helped create. These films grappled with the loneliness, the regret, and the emotional cost of a life spent behind armor. It was as if, through his art, he was examining the Bronson question from the inside: what is the price of surviving into toughness? Bronson, meanwhile, continued his path, the weariness beneath his iconic intensity becoming more pronounced, the weight of his own persona seeming to grow heavier with time. When Charles Bronson passed away in 2003, Clint Eastwood made no public statement, gave no interview. His silence was profound. But those close to him sensed the depth of that quiet. It was the silence that follows the departure of the only other person who truly understands the landscape you inhabit. Years later, in a reflective moment, Eastwood finally expanded on his famous one-line judgment. He spoke of Bronson's childhood and the mines, his late-blooming stardom, the unvarnished reality he brought to every role. He didn't act, Eastwood said. He just showed you what survival looks like. Then he offered the startling, vulnerable truth behind their lifelong distance: if we'd worked together, the audience would have seen too much. They would have seen what we both knew but never said. That all of it, the toughness, the silence, the control, all of it comes from fear. Fear that if you let the armor down, you won't be able to put it back up. In that admission lies the entire story. This was not a rivalry of ego, but a mutual recognition of cost. They were mirrors reflecting a similar truth, one carefully polished, the other naturally withered. To work together would have been to hold those mirrors up to each other, reflecting an endless, exposing loop that would have shown the world the fragile humanity behind two supposedly indestructible icons. Clint Eastwood never underestimated Charles Bronson because he recognized in him the ultimate, untamed source of the very thing he had spent a lifetime carefully manufacturing. And in the world of men who trade in perception, that is the one force you do not challenge. You simply tip your hat, keep your distance, and let the legend stand, unchallenged, untested, and forever respected.